Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving deep into a case from 2019, the
Ye
Family Court of Nova Scotia.
Oh, right.
And this case is fascinating because it really shows how complicated these interprovincial custody battles can get.
Yeah, absolutely. It really brings up so many different issues.
It
We're
does.
talking about child protection concerns,
Right.
grandparents who are fighting for custody of their grandchildren, and then this whole other jurisdictional back and forth between two provinces.
Yeah, and trying to figure out, like,
Yeah,
where do we even start with this sort of thing?
exactly. Yeah, who gets to decide?
Exactly. It's a story that goes from Labrador to Nova Scotia and back again. So, to set the stage, we have two young children,
Okay.
DM and SM, and the big question is who gets to decide where they live, Nova Scotia or Labrador?
Yeah, and it's not even just about geography, right? It's
Yeah.
really about which court has the authority
Right.
to make these decisions that are going to affect these kids' lives.
Right. Okay, so let's rewind to the beginning of this story. The children initially lived with their mother in Labrador,
Okay.
but their father and the paternal grandparents, they'd already moved to Nova Scotia.
Right.
What happened that kind of brought the kids into the picture? Like, how did they end up in Nova Scotia?
So things were not good for the kids in Labrador,
Right.
unfortunately. In 2016, the manager of Child and Youth Family Services in Labrador, they had to step in because there were just all these concerns about the kids' well-being with their mom.
Okay, so what were some of these concerns? What were they seeing?
So we're talking about things like domestic violence between the parents, substance abuse issues, and just a really, really rough living environment for these kids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Those are some heavy accusations.
they are.
Were there any specific incidents that happened that really set off alarm bells for Child Protective Services?
Yeah, there were actually a few. So DM, he's the older child, he had actually already been removed from his parents back in 2014
Oh,
because of similar concerns. But the event that really got this whole ball rolling was in 2016 when child protection workers, they found DM at home alone,
oh no.
locked in his bedroom, and the conditions were just awful, really unsanitary, just really bad.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
That's awful.
it's heartbreaking.
So did the children go to live with their grandparents in Nova Scotia at that point?
Not immediately. So first, the Labrador court actually awarded custody to the manager of Child and Youth Family Services.
Oh, okay.
And then, get this, the manager placed the children with their grandparents in Nova Scotia
Okay.
under the significant other foster care arrangement.
So even though the children were living with their grandparents in Nova Scotia, legally, the manager in Labrador was still the one who was like the legal decision maker for these kids.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it.
Wow.
That's exactly right. So this whole arrangement, this went on for about 3 years.
Okay.
And this brings us up to 2019. And that's where things start to get really complicated, at least legally speaking.
Oh.
Because that's when this whole jurisdictional battle really gets going.
Because by that point, the kids had been living in Nova Scotia for 3 years.
Right.
So did the fact that they've been living there for 3 years automatically give the Nova Scotia court the right to make a decision about their custody?
That is a great question, and it really gets to the heart of this case.
Okay.
So there's a two-step legal test that the courts use to determine jurisdiction.
Okay.
The first thing the Nova Scotia court had to figure out was, could they even take this case on?
So they were trying to figure out if they were legally allowed to make a decision.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the more interesting part. Even if they could legally take the case, should they?
Okay.
And this second step, that often involves something called a real and substantial connection test.
Okay, break that down for me. What does real and substantial connection actually mean in this situation?
Basically, the court is looking at whether there are strong enough links between the children and Nova Scotia
Okay.
to justify them making a ruling. And this is where things get really, really complicated.
Because even though they were living in Nova Scotia, the reason they ended up in Nova Scotia stemmed from what was going on in Labrador.
Precisely. Yeah, you're exactly right. And there's actually another layer here, too.
Okay.
Because remember those child protection proceedings?
Okay.
Those were still ongoing in Labrador.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So all this is going on, and the grandparents in Nova Scotia, they decide to apply for custody of DM and SM.
So you've got competing custody applications happening in two different provinces.
Got it.
And then in the background, this child protection case that's still up in the air.
It's a mess.
What a mess.
It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
And then on top of that, you've got the mom who is still living in Labrador, and she decides to file for custody in Labrador, too.
Yes.
So it's like grandparents versus mom, and then in the background, you've got this unresolved child protection
A
case.
real legal thriller.
Yeah, like how does this even happen?
Exactly. It's a lot, right?
Yeah.
So now put yourself in the shoes of this Nova Scotia court, right?
Yeah.
They have to look at the children's time in Nova Scotia, this ongoing case in Labrador, all the evidence which is spread across two provinces,
Right.
and decide, are they the right ones to be making a decision here?
And ultimately, it comes down to what is in the best interest of these two children.
Yes,
Yen
100%.
and SM.
But figuring that out, as you can imagine, is far from simple.
So did they decide to take it on?
Well,
Come on.
that's for next time. Well, you're not going to believe this.
Okay.
The Nova Scotia court, they actually decided to decline jurisdiction.
What?
They said, you know what? This needs to be handled by the court in Labrador.
Wait, so even though the kids had been living in Nova Scotia for 3 years, they were basically like, nope, not our problem.
It's not quite like that.
Okay.
They definitely heard out the grandparents and considered their concerns, but they recognized that a lot of the really important evidence and the key witnesses in this case, they were all in Labrador.
Well, yeah, they couldn't just ignore everything that had happened that led to the kids being removed from their mother's care in the first place. Right?
Exactly. They had to consider the whole history. And to do that properly, they needed to make sure that everyone's side of the story was heard.
So were they basically trying to avoid having two separate courts making two separate decisions about the same kids?
Yeah, it was partly about keeping things streamlined.
Mhm.
You know, nobody wants to drag out legal proceedings across two provinces if they can help it, especially not in a case as sensitive as this one,
No, absolutely not.
and especially not when you're talking about young children who need stability.
Right. Right, because imagine how confusing and stressful it would be for the kids if one court said one thing and another court said something different. It
Exactly.
would just create chaos for them.
Yeah, it'd be like getting two sets of instructions at the same time.
Right.
You're just going to get lost.
It just makes sense to have it all centralized.
Exactly. And, you know, on top of all that, the Nova Scotia court, they specifically said that they wanted to avoid the possibility of conflicting orders,
Right.
which, as you can imagine, would just make an already messy situation a million times worse
Oh, for sure.
for everyone involved.
So they decided not to decide, basically.
Well, they couldn't just abandon the kids while they waited for the Labrador court to take over, right?
Right, because the kids still needed to be cared for. They
Exactly.
needed a place to live. They needed stability.
Exactly. And that's where the whole idea of an interim order comes in.
Okay, what's an interim order?
So it's basically a temporary ruling that's designed to bridge the gap until a more permanent decision can be made.
So like a standby plan to keep things running smoothly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what did the interim order actually say?
So they granted custody to the grandparents in Nova Scotia, but, and this is a big but, they made it very, very clear that this wasn't a final decision about who would raise these children.
So the kids could stay with their grandparents for now, but the Labrador court was going to make the final call.
Exactly.
It's like pressing pause, but not turning off the movie entirely.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
And, you know, I think the Nova Scotia court really wanted to emphasize that their involvement wasn't over.
Okay.
They weren't just washing their hands of the situation.
Right.
They were saying, look, we're going to step back for now. We recognize that the Labrador court, they're really in a much better position to look at all the angles here. You know,
Okay.
they have more of the initial information, they understand the history of the case a little bit better, and they can actually keep an eye on things more easily because it's their jurisdiction.
It seems like a pretty reasonable approach. Like they were trying to find that balance between what needed to happen right now and what would be best in the long term.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I really think it shows how seriously they were taking their responsibility towards these kids. You know, they didn't want to just uproot them from the home they'd known for the past 3 years without knowing what the future held for them back in Labrador.
Yeah, because it could have been very disruptive to just pick them up and move them again without knowing if things back in Labrador had actually changed, you know?
Absolutely.
Like, was it even going to be a good situation for them?
Right. And think about it. For DM, the older child, who'd already been through so much upheaval in his life,
Poor DM.
imagine how unsettling that would be for
Oh.
him, you know? So they opted for a more cautious approach, and I think that really speaks volumes about their commitment to putting the children's well-being first.
Okay, so the Nova Scotia court bows out, passes the baton to the Labrador court.
Passes the baton. I love that.
Okay, so what did the Labrador court decide?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see about that.
What? Come on.
Unfortunately, we don't have access to that information.
What a cliffhanger. I want to know what happened.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It would be fascinating to see how they sorted through everything, but even without that final piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
This case still gives us a lot to think about.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it really highlights how complicated these jurisdictional issues can get, right?
For sure. This has been really eye-opening.
And, it makes you realize how important it is for families, especially those who are thinking of moving between provinces, to really understand how the law works in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, because you can't just assume that everything will be fine.
Exactly.
Because every province has its own rules and regulations.
Precisely. Yeah, you can't just assume that what flies in one province is going to fly in another.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth and forget that there are real kids whose lives are being impacted by all of this.
Absolutely. That's so important to remember. At the end of the day, it's all about what's best for the children.
Right. They're the most important piece of this whole puzzle.
100%.
So the case goes back to Labrador. It's like this whole legal journey has taken us right back to where it all started.
It's true. It's like a homecoming for this case.
And now it's up to the Labrador court to decide what's best for DM and SM. What kind of things do you think they would consider? Like, what were the big factors for them?
Well, they had a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, these kids have been living in Nova Scotia for 3 years, but the initial problems, the reasons they were sent there, those all stemmed from their life in Labrador. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing.
Right, because you've got their life in Nova Scotia, which is what they've known for the past few years, and then you've got this whole other history in Labrador. How do you even begin to compare those two?
Exactly. It's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
They would definitely looked at how attached the kids were to their grandparents, how they were doing in school, that kind of thing.
Okay, so trying to figure out, like, had Nova Scotia become their real home at that point?
Yeah.
But they couldn't just forget about everything that happened before.
Exactly. No, they had to look at the mom, too, and see if she had made any changes in her life.
So, had she addressed those issues that led to the kids being removed from her care in the first place?
Exactly. Like, were there any support systems in place? Had she gotten help for those issues? Those are crucial things they would have looked at.
It makes you wonder, what did the Labrador court decide?
I know, right? It's the big question.
Did they send the kids back to their mom, or did they say, you know what, they're better off staying in Nova Scotia with their grandparents?
It's a nail biter for sure, but unfortunately, that information isn't part of what we have for today's deep dive.
Oh, man, I hate a cliffhanger ending. I really want to know what happened to DM and SM.
No, I know. It would have been amazing to see how it all unfolded in the end.
Yeah?
But even without that last piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
I think this case really shows us just how complicated these interprovincial custody cases can be.
For sure. Like, I knew it was complicated, but I had no idea just how much goes into these decisions.
Right. It's like a whole other world with its own rules and its own language.
And it's a good reminder that these aren't just abstract legal battles, you know? There are real families, real kids at the heart of all of this.
Absolutely. And sometimes I think it's easy to get so caught up in the legal arguments that we forget about the human side of things.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today. It's been a really fascinating deep dive into the world of interprovincial custody disputes and the challenges of determining what's truly best for children caught in the middle of it all.
It really has. And, for anyone listening who might be going through something similar or knows someone who is, please remember there are resources out there to help.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it. There are people who understand these situations and can provide guidance and support.
Absolutely. And don't give up hope. These situations are tough, but there are ways to navigate them and find the best possible outcome for everyone involved.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring this complex and important topic with you. Until next time.